Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Impact 2012. I'm Anna Nugent. I'm one of the coordinating producers of the festival, along with Alex Mallory. And Impact is a 6.5-week political arts festival that's dedicated to critical issues leading up to this year's national election. We have 44-day festival with films, theater, comedy, conversation, music, poetry, and we're here through the end of August, through the 26th. So we've loads of different events. Tomorrow we're screening Addiction Incorporated, so we'd love to see you all here. This week we're focusing on democracy matters, Citizens United, voter suppression, and constitutional rights. And I am thrilled to welcome to the stage Isaiah Castilla, Mimi Marziani, and Diana Sen. And let me just tell you a little bit about Isaiah, and then he'll introduce the rest of the panel. Isaiah serves as Advocacy, Prograins, Counsel at the Alliance for Justice. Prior to joining AFJ, Isaiah was a founding member of the Castilla Law Group and worked in finance direction for a number of political campaigns. So he knows a lot about all these subjects. So please give a warm welcome to the panel for tonight.
All right, well, we're glad to be here today, and I just want to first introduce our wonderful panelists this evening. We have Mimi Marziani. Mimi serves as counsel for the program at NYU School of Law's Brennan Center for Justice, where she focuses on money and politics, voting rights, and legislative dysfunction. Mimi frequently writes on democracy issues and has contributed opinion editorials to U.S. News and World Report, the National Law Journal, Politico, and the New York Law Journal. In September 2010, she was invited to testify on the constitutionality of filibuster reform before the Senate Committee on Rules and Administration. Let's give Mimi a hand. And to my right, we have Diana Sen. Diana is Senior Counsel for LatinoJustice, PearlDeaf, where she heads their practice working to safeguard the civil rights of Latinos in the southeastern United States. Diana is immediate past president of the Hispanic National Bar Association and is the chair of the Civil Rights Committee of the New York State Bar. She has received many awards, including an Outstanding Women Award from El Diario and an Outstanding In-House Counsel Award, lots of awards, from the National Bar Association Nonprofit Committee. And let's give Diana a hand. So, as I said before, I'm glad to be here. I'm Isaiah Castilla. I'm with Alliance for Justice, and we're privileged and thankful to have the Culture Project as one of our member organizations. And so we think this subject that we're talking about today is extremely important, and I think both of you would agree it's extremely important issues that we're facing today in our democracy, the question of participation and power of the people. So I wanted to start off by just talking to you for Diana, just beginning with you. If you could kind of talk about, I know a few states, I think about 10 states have recently passed what some people are describing as very intense and restrictive voter ID, photo ID laws. And, you know, oftentimes when I talk to people about this issue, the question is always, what's the big deal, right? Everybody has a photo ID. Can you just talk to us about voter ID, why this is an important issue, and why it's so restrictive to so many people?
Absolutely. Well, I think the real key is the assumption that everyone has IDs is not a correct assumption at all. And there are many people who don't have IDs, have expired IDs, have lost their IDs. They may not necessarily be able to afford to get IDs or take off from their regular jobs during the limited hours that the DMV is open. So I think that the assumption that everyone has IDs is something that's difficult. I think what's also really important about a lot of these voter ID laws is that you may actually have an ID, but you may not have it with you at the time when you actually go to a poll. So there's just general barriers, and for us, we believe it to be sort of a barrier to voting and to be disenfranchising. And we think that that's really the key. It's not whether you have the ID or not. It's whether you have the right to vote and are able to exercise that right.
And what groups do you think, or what people, demographics-wise, would be most impacted by these laws?
Well, we definitely find that minority voters are most impacted. And basically, dependent on the state, we've done some analysis where we find that minority voters are disproportionately impacted. And we find that if you look at the numbers, it's pretty stark. And I know one example is obviously South Carolina that I know Mimi is battling with in federal court as we speak.
And I know recently today in Pennsylvania, there was a ruling that came down on the Pennsylvania voter ID law. And so there's a belief out there, some believe that it's one party is trying to restrict certain voters from being able to have an opportunity to vote. And could you talk about any cases or that case in Pennsylvania? What exactly happened there, and what does the law say, and what does it mean for the citizens there in that state?
Well, my understanding is that the federal judge felt that, or believed that the voter ID law at issue in Pennsylvania did not pose a high burden on the individual voter. But, so he found that it was acceptable.
I can actually, I'm fairly familiar with the Pennsylvania lawsuit. I mean, what's striking about Pennsylvania, it's a state court case, actually, and it was brought under the state constitutional right to vote. And this was a pretty heavy lift for the plaintiffs because just the way that the law is written, it sets a very high bar for that sort of challenge. You know, despite that high bar, the plaintiffs in that case brought some pretty amazing facts to life. First, the state of Pennsylvania admitted that there are no cases of in-person fraud, meaning that there is no problem that the ID law would address.
Right. And that's the whole, apparently,
Yes.
like the whole premise of these voter ID laws is there's
That's
so
exactly
much
right.
voter fraud, right?
And then the second thing is the plaintiffs also successfully showed that, I mean, there's still some dispute, but and the court affirmed today that somewhere between 1% and 9% of Pennsylvania's registered voter population lacks one of the acceptable IDs. So we're talking about hundreds and thousands of people. Ultimately, unfortunately, the court found that the plaintiffs couldn't get over that high bar because, I mean, in my view, the court just misinterpreted the facts. I mean, he said that it wasn't kind of a pervasive enough burden among the population. That, of course, is missing the point, right? Because we know that most people have IDs. That's a fact, right? 90% of the population, rough estimate, has a driver's license or the other types of IDs that are required. The problem is it's a huge burden for the minority that do not currently have IDs, and these folks tend to be disproportionately racial minorities, young, disabled, elderly, and that, of course, is where the burden on voting is most problematic. So it was a really unfortunate ruling out of Pennsylvania today.
Yeah, and I found it was really interesting when the House Majority Leader there in Pennsylvania had some comments about the voter ID law. In fact, he said it would help Mitt Romney win. And do you think that politics plays a role in these laws at all? Is it about voter fraud? I mean, what do the numbers show? I know Pennsylvania may be one case, but...
Well, I would just say, I mean, we don't look at things on a political basis. We're obviously nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations who are focused on the opportunity for citizens to be able to vote equally. We obviously can't opine on, the bases for these type of voter ID laws because obviously we're not initiating that. However, I'm sure there have been, very vocal media outlets that have sort of reported on the impact that those not only that these voter ID laws have on minority voters, but also there might be some type of partisan correlation, but that's not something that we particularly deal with.
I mean, we too are nonpartisan, completely nonpartisan organization. And I too agree that, I obviously would not speak to the mindset of every single lawmaker that's passed these types of laws into existence. I will say, though, that in state after state after state, we know that there is not a problem with in-person voter fraud. And for the most part, when we look at state legislative records, the lawmakers don't seem to think there's a problem either. And that raises the big question. If you're not actually seeking the problem that you say you're seeking to solve the problem you say you're trying to solve, well, what are you doing? And I mean, that leaves you, you can draw your own conclusions, but it's also a fact that after the 2010 election, and we saw state legislatures change party hands all across the country, that after that occurrence, there was a wave of these photo ID laws. And they don't just require identification to vote, which nobody has a problem with, right? Obviously, we need to keep our elections secure. The problem is they require a very select set of IDs to vote. And these select set of IDs have, A, nothing to do with actually proving your identity, which you could do in a variety of ways, and B, do nothing to solve a non-existent problem, but actually just burden voting. And so all that is to say is, I would never speak to the mindset of every single person, but it was a national movement to enact these laws, and it does certainly have a whiff of trying to change the rules in the middle of the game.
Yeah, and that's, I guess what, I don't want us to venture off into partisanship, but because that's one of the things we try not to do is, or keep an eye on.
And we do have Republican leaders, like the House Majority Leader in Pennsylvania, saying straight up, right, we did this because we want Romney to win.
Right, yeah.
which is
so there's voter ID, and there's also some other issues, and we were talking about this backstage. We were talking about the Florida voter purge, and how it could potentially affect Latino voters in that state. Can you talk a little bit about that voter purge, that movement down there?
Absolutely, and we definitely don't believe it's potentially going to disproportionately impact Latino voters. Basically, the Florida Secretary of State, Ken Densner, came up with a particular plan of taking a list that could have 182,000 registered voters on that list. And he took that list and determined that that list may have alleged non-citizens. And that list was compiled from looking at, Department of Motor Vehicle data. And from that 182,000 potential list in the state of Florida, which we all know is obviously a very key state in the national election in November. But he started with sort of doing a test of having a 2,600 person list. And with that list, we immediately were obviously very engaged. Of that list, that 2,600 person list, which is obviously just a small portion, 58% of those were Latino voters. And if you collectively look at that list, almost 80% were minority voters. So could you imagine, it's almost like you're targeting Latino and minority voters to disenfranchise them, people who have already been registered to vote.
Do you guys all know what purging, that's kind of a term of art.
Talk about purging.
All states have voter registration rolls, and actually they have to go through some sort of process to keep these rolls up to date, because people move, people die, some people just never show up to vote again. So there have to be mechanisms to keep the rolls clean and accurate. And I think that all of our organizations support that. However, the problem becomes when these purges happen, especially when it's so close to an election, which could leave people without recourse and without the ability to detect it in time. And when you have a purge that is based on, obviously criteria that has nothing to do with keeping the rolls accurate, I mean, that's when we really are concerned. And that's what's typically referred to, I think, commonly as a purge versus list maintenance.
Basically, there's systematic maintenance that is something that's allowed and obviously favored and something that election officials often do. But this was a particular list that targeted individuals. And what they did is the data wasn't accurate or even reliable. And many people on the list not only were citizens, but we even had like a war veteran hero who was born in Brooklyn and obviously fought for our country and was on the list. And they took a database like the Department of Motor Vehicles that doesn't even deal with citizenship issues at all, and ended up taking that database, which we all know is very outdated, and took that to sort of target a list of 2,600. And from that, I mean, there are many litigations, many lawsuits that filed, particularly the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against the state of Florida in the Northern District of Florida, in the northern part of the state, stating that this purge using 2,600 was not only not a reliable list and believed to be discriminatory because it had a disproportionate impact on minority voters, but also because it was very close to an election. Mm-hmm. And basically, there's the National Voter Registration Act that states that you cannot purge someone from the voter list 90 days before an election. Because basically, people should have the opportunity to vote and to know that they're going to vote, and they can't be taken off the list in such a short time period for the election. And a lot of that, too, is just to, ensure the veracity of the election. So after the Department of Justice filed suit, we ended up filing suit as well in the Southern District of Florida, because a lot of the voters, the majority of the voters from that 2,600 person list were from South Florida. Mm-hmm. And we believed it had a disproportionate impact on minority voters. And we filed not only saying that Florida could not purge so close to the election primary, which was actually yesterday, but also that it had a disproportionate impact on minority voters. And then there was another lawsuit that was also filed in the Middle District of Florida under a very important section called Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And basically, if the state of Florida's 5 counties or other parts of the United States, before they can change any type of voter registration requirement or election requirement or anything dealing with elections, they have to get pre-clearance from either the Department of Justice or they have to go through the DC District Court. And that lawsuit emanated from the fact that the state of Florida was changing this very important election issue and did not provide notice or get pre-clearance. So there were 3 competing lawsuits that practically were filed simultaneously. And our lawsuit, continues, and we continue to fight this issue. So the good part is that after the Secretary of State realized the unreliability of this list that they were attempting to use, they ended up temporarily stopping the purge. But we found out today that the Secretary of State is now announcing that he will reinitiate the purge. And one lawsuit that I forgot to mention, in addition to the 3 that I mentioned, is that the state of Florida actually sued the Department of Homeland Security, asking for access to its SAVE database so that it could get citizenship information so that it could continue to purge its voters. And ultimately, the Department of Homeland Security is working with the state of Florida to be able to give them access to that database.
And by the way, in case you were wondering, there's also no problem with non-citizens voting, right? Like, people don't do that because it would be a ludicrous thing to do. Obviously, the gain you could get from it would be very small, 1 vote, but the potential downside is deportation, fines, jail. I mean, you'd have to be completely unhinged to do that sort of act. And so there's a reason that we don't actually see, some sort of rampant wave of people without proper papers trying to vote. It's another non-existent problem.
And it's also a felony in Florida, so.
Right.
So there are all kinds of shenanigans going on in Florida.
That's
on
a
the
good
voter.
word.
Yeah, and there's also the voter registration law. In Florida.
We had 2 lawsuits in
It's
Florida.
really restricted. Can you talk about that just briefly, maybe, on the voter registration restrictions they put on some organizations trying to.
So last year, Florida passed an omnibus bill that in many ways encapsulated many of the negative voting law changes that we've seen in the last 2 years. The Florida bill made it harder to stay registered to vote when you moved from one county to another. It eliminated the early voting period, particularly the Sunday right before election, where I think, if I have my math right, I think 50% of the African American population in Florida chose to cast their ballot in 2008. It placed extremely onerous restrictions on groups like the League of Women Voters and Rock the Vote that go out and do community-based voter registration activity, essentially putting those groups out of business. And
have to get the
no,
applications in.
There was something
in
else
2
bad,
days.
but
yeah.
So 2 lawsuits came out of that. One, as we were saying before, there are 5 counties in Florida that are covered by the Voting Rights Act. And so before they can enact any sort of voting change, they have to seek permission from the federal government. That permission was denied, and they sued. Simultaneously, the Brennan Center, working with a law firm here in New York and representing Rock the Vote, the League of Women Voters, and U.S. PIRG, we filed a lawsuit in the Northern District of Florida saying that these new restrictions on voter registration drives were unconstitutional, that they violated the First Amendment rights of speech and association of these folks on the ground at farmers markets, at colleges, telling people that voting is good and trying to encourage people to vote. And I'm very happy to say that we were successful in that lawsuit. The judge pointed out that all of these restrictions were completely unnecessary, and they were ludicrous. One was from the moment you collected a voter registration form, you had to get it into the state within 48 hours, or you would get fined. There was also a rule that before you could ask to collect, you don't even need to be a lawyer for like the free speech bells to go off here. Before you were allowed to ask somebody if they wanted you, before you're allowed to say, can I help you, fill out and submit your completed voter registration form, you had to get approval from the state. So there was just a straight up prior restraint requirement. And then there was all sorts of administrative burdens. Volunteers, Rock the Vote's a great example. They have college kid volunteers. They have a whole internal training program. They've never had a problem. But the new law would have made them track every single one of their volunteers, including their address, and when they terminate their employment. Which all these things are just ludicrous if you've ever worked with a grassroots nonprofit. So luckily, we got the law enjoined, and as of Friday, actually, we reached a settlement agreement with the state by which the biggest part is they basically agreed to consent to that injunction. So that means those laws are no longer in place, and groups are back on the ground doing voter registration work.
That's great. And so I just want to shift gears and stay here with you for a minute, Mimi, and talk about let me ask this first. Who knows about Citizens United? Who's heard about it? Okay, so that's pretty much the whole group, everybody, pretty much the whole crowd. So can you talk a little bit about, and again, we wanted to try to bring this all together and talk about democracy and participation in our democracy. Talk about Citizens United.
Citizens United it's often used as a shorthand to refer to lots of different problems in the campaign finance system, but specifically the lawsuit was a case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in January 2010, and the Supreme Court's main holding was that corporations have the same rights to spend money on political advertisements as human beings. And in doing so, it struck down a longstanding law that required corporations to form a separate political committee to spend in elections. And those separate political committees could not be funded by straight up profits or by general treasury funds. They had to be funded by contributions from employees and things like that. So even though we previously did have corporations spending money in elections, the actual money came from human beings, and it was just, kind of through a committee that was associated with the business. Citizens United changed all that. It said that corporations, both for-profit and nonprofit, could just reach into their general coffers and start spending money on campaign advertisements. Obviously, the potential magnitude of this decision is astronomical. I mean, a group like ExxonMobil, which I think had $1 million in its PAC in 2008, but had a $90 million worth of 90 billion, I have no idea, some sort of crazy number, some sort of crazy number in profits that, theoretically at least, they could spend all of that on political advertisements. I mean, it's a pretty scary thought. From that ruling, the part of that ruling that's talked about the most is this notion that corporations have the same First Amendment rights to spend money on political advertisements. The second part of the ruling, though, that's not as typically discussed, was the notion that if I spend money independently of a candidate campaign but to benefit that candidate, somehow that money cannot be corrupting. And so let me give an example. Right. So Sheldon Adelson, as many people know, gave millions and millions of dollars to Newt Gingrich's presidential campaign while Newt Gingrich was still running. So under the Supreme Court's logic, and the super PAC, of course, is very closely affiliated to Newt Gingrich's campaign, but they are not technically connected. They're different entities. It's run by his friends and close colleagues, and obviously he knows everything that's going on, but
they're not connected.
But as a legal matter, they're clearly not connected. Right. So under the Supreme Court's logic, because they are legally independent, Newt Gingrich's money in no way could corrupt. Sheldon Adelson's money in no way could corrupt Newt Gingrich if he were to be elected president. This defies common sense. It's hard. People always have me explain this twice because it seems like such a crazy thing to say. But that reasoning is actually the logical route to super PACs. Because once you take the premise that independent spending cannot corrupt, the next step is to say, then therefore you can place basically no limits on groups that only collect and spend independently of candidates. And that's what happened. And it created these mutant political committees, super PACs, that can collect donations in any amount and then spend that money in any amount to aid candidate campaigns. And that's where we are right now. And so now we're heading into the most expensive election season ever. And most of that money, well, we'll see. Maybe not most, but a huge, huge, huge amount of money, millions and millions of dollars, is going to come not from candidates, and at least like a candidate has to show up at the end of the day on the ballot, and we can tell the candidate what we think about them by voting. But most of this money is coming in by independent groups that, A, for the most part, are not disclosing all of their donors, and B, we have very few ways to hold them truly accountable. So it's a really, it's a crazy situation. Yeah. No one's quite sure what's going to happen.
So are we at a point now, sorry, I'm dropping the papers, but are we at a point now, because it seems to me money in politics has always been a problem, and are we at that tipping point now? Is that how you see it? We're now at the height of money in politics, and it's getting to be too much. How do we change course at this point?
I hope we're at a tipping point. And the thing that gives me actually a lot of hope is that 3 years ago, if I had been giving this talk, nobody in this audience would have had any idea. Nobody would have heard of a single campaign finance case decided by the Supreme Court.
Right.
Since Citizens United, this issue has come to the forefront of the public's attention. I mean, mostly for worse, but also for better, because it's a serious issue, and we had huge problems before Citizens United as well. So my hope is that the public will really get angry, because there are things that we can do. There are legislative fixes. There are, there are certainly people that are rallying behind a constitutional amendment. There's also ways to bring litigation and to convince the Supreme Court eventually that it was wrong. There's all sorts of things that we can actually do. We can shame candidates. I mean, that's another thing. To say, to tell a candidate, look, I'm not going to vote for you unless you tell these independent groups to stop spending millions of dollars on negative campaigns. I mean, if we show that doesn't work, it doesn't work, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the voter still has the power. And as long as people are paying attention and starting to get angry, I think that we actually can do something about the situation.
And you talked about a constitutional amendment. I know there are a few of them out there and related to the impact of Citizens United. How realistic or feasible is a constitutional amendment? What would you like to see, or what could you see in a constitutional amendment that you think would be something workable that people could get behind?
I honestly have very, very mixed feelings about a constitutional amendment for the following reasons. One, something that's great about it is it is easy to understand and it's easy to get behind, which is those are important aspects of reform if you really want to have a reform movement. On the other hand, it is extremely, extremely difficult to amend the Constitution. I mean, it's I won't say impossible, but it is almost, it's inconceivable to think that the Constitution will be amended over this issue. On a more, and on top of that, on a more philosophical level, I get really nervous about amending the Constitution, even when there's a huge problem like this. I mean, in my view, Citizens United was wrongly decided. And I think that there's nothing wrong with the Constitution. It's something wrong with the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution. So from my point of view, the better method is to persuade the Supreme Court that it's wrong. And I think that is doable. So that's my preferred approach. I mean, do I think people should stop pushing for a constitutional amendment? No, not necessarily. I think it's a great way to spread awareness about this issue. But I will, I guess, just note that I don't think it's a silver bullet.
Like, of all of you in the audience, do you note a difference after seeing the presidential campaigns, whether it be the Republican primary or the like, of seeing this involvement with, super PACs and how just palpably as an observer, as a voter, things seem to change. Mm-hmm. Whether we know about the Supreme Court decision specifically and what was allowed and not allowed, or whether we just watch TV to see how the candidates play. But I think that the whole super PAC concept is something that has been particularly new in voters' minds and something that I think that there's increased awareness for.
True. Yeah. We've done some polling on the issue, and I wish I had it in front of me. You can see it on the Brennan Center's website, but it's something like 80% of Americans think that super PAC spending will lead to corruption in government. And it just goes from there. And so the other scary thing about it is, this is actually causing people to have less faith in our democratic system. And that in itself is terrifying to me, because at the end of the day, that's the way that the democracy can only work if we believe that it works. Not to sound a little really meta, but that's true. We have to go out and vote and believe that the voting process works. If we get disenchanted with the process and believe that our vote doesn't count and sit home on election day, then it really doesn't count. Right. And then we don't have any power, and it's not a government for the people, by the people. And so, that to me is just absolutely terrifying.
Are there any other ways? Because I guess I found when working in the finance shop and raising money on these campaigns, you repeatedly kind of reach out to the same crowd and ask them
Yeah.
for money, and it's over and over. And candidates seem to want to change that. Most candidates want to raise small dollars or kind of venture outside of, at least the candidates I was working with want to venture outside of, these donors who can give big money.
Right.
But in terms of getting people involved in the process, are there any other ways we can do that? I know here in New York City they have a great campaign finance participation, donor matching program where a donor's contribution is worth more, which gets people involved in the process.
Yeah.
Can you?
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that when we're talking about comprehensive modes of reform, that small donor, multiple match public financing programs are the absolute best reform measure that I can come up with. And the gist of it is, and New York City has probably the most successful model of this, but the Brennan Center, along with other organizations, has been advocating for a similar model at the federal level. The gist is this: the government matches small contributions to a candidate. And so what that means is if I give a candidate $100, they actually get, that's matched with $600 more. And then you can couple that with lower contribution limits so that you're actually then forcing candidates to fundraise for more people, and you're not allowing them to take big money from particularly wealthy donors. And there's a lot of other ways then kind of within the complications of the current campaign finance structure that you could, in exchange for giving government money, basically have candidates cut off from these other modes of financing that allow really rich individuals to have a disproportionate impact. And through that mechanism, and we've seen it successfully work in New York City and other places, you can actually change the way that candidates campaign. And,
right.
and it is
right.
amazing. I mean, it means that you have candidates, it means that candidates have a financial incentive to reach out to more people, to keep going back to the same small donors, because, I mean, you put a cap, obviously, on what you can take from any small donor, but it actually, for the first time, gives a candidate an incentive to say, hey, why don't you give me $25? And then because then the government matches it, and it's looking more like a real, from the candidate's point of view, a real donation. And then the candidate can say, look, and if you like what I'm doing 6 months from now, you can give 25 more bucks, which again is multiplied by the government, so it means much more to the candidate. And I mean, again, and we've seen this work in New York City. Another striking thing about the model in New York City is it means that the donors become much more representative of the population. So right now, it is, I mean, it's not even the 1% that donate, that give serious donations to political campaigns. It's like the 0.00001%. I mean, for the most part, only the very wealthy, and I mean like very wealthy in this country, give lots of money to political campaigns. However, we've seen it in New York City. What you have is all of a sudden you have regular people who are giving more money because the candidates have an incentive to go get it from them, and because the donor believes that it counts more. And it really changes the dynamics. And it's a pretty amazing thing. And so that is our absolute best proposal for the federal level.
I feel like we have to have a comprehensive strategy to fix this problem. I think people are getting more involved and starting to pay attention to these issues, and just moving from you were talking about demographics and how Citizens United is bringing people together, how the public financing system here in New York is changing the demographics of people giving to campaigns. And I wanted to come back to you, Diana, and kind of talk about voting again. I was talking to someone about some of the things going on with voter ID and this movement to change the right to vote, and they affect people's right to vote. And their question to me was, and I'll play devil's advocate for a minute. They said, those people don't vote anyway. These groups don't vote. These groups don't vote. what are the numbers? Why should people care about everyone having the right to vote? I've heard this question because I did a conference for the National Alliance Council on Homelessness, and we were talking about homeless voters and the need to register homeless voters, and that we can register homeless voters. And that's when this conversation came up. And somebody said, well, these people don't vote, so it doesn't really matter, the people who aren't. Why does it matter that people have the right to vote here in America? Why is that important?
Well, I would definitely say that voting is a fundamental right, that not only the Supreme Court believes it to be fundamental, but I think it's something that's very important. And I think it's the individual voter who has the right and to determine whether that person will vote or not. And someone else should not say that person's vote is less worthy than my vote, and because of that, I'm going to disenfranchise them.
I just think it's so important to kind of reinforce the point that.
But the other amazing thing is, we've been talking about the voter ID laws and the laws that we've seen recently, which are truly egregious.
Yeah.
But putting those laws aside, our voter registration system is unlike any other civilized democracy. We are, to my knowledge, the only civilized democracy that puts the burden on the voter to jump through all these bureaucratic hoops to get registered.
Right.
And, and there are a lot of reasons that people don't vote. I actually think that a big part is a lack of civic education, which is another huge problem. Right. But at least part of the problem is that it's a pain in the ass to vote.
Yeah.
Right? And people, and at the end of the day, a lot of people they're like, want to vote, whatever. I'm just not going to do it. We have one day in the middle of the work week.
Yeah, in the middle of the work week.
Limited hours.
Right.
You have to register 30 days in advance. If you move, you have to re-register. You can't do it online. It's completely crazy. It is like the most archaic, burdensome thing that I can imagine.
I think even with that, I think it's really important to vote, and I think that it's particularly special when you talk to people who are new citizens, and for the first time in their lives, they're finally going to be able to vote. And it's such a special moment because through voting, obviously, you can effectuate change, and you actually have a voice. So I think it's something that is really fundamental, and it's very special when you hear people who really are spending, are having the first opportunity to vote. I think it's also something that's particularly empowering to the minority communities, particularly Latinos, because you have many people who are able to serve as the voice for their family members, by voting. And that's something that we think is really important. The one thing I wanted to mention too is in that Florida voter purge lawsuit, I wanted to really also give credit to the other civil rights coalition that's working with us on that case. Not only is it LatinoJustice Pearl Deaf, but we're working on that case with Advancement Project and Project Vote and Fair Elections Legal Network, in addition to working with Jenner and Block. So I just wanted to make sure because, they've been working really actively, and this has been something that hit in the middle of May, and we had just such a short time to fight the Florida voter purge, and of course the fighting continues.
Well, we've had a really, really good discussion today and kind of explored these issues. I don't know if there are any pressing questions anyone may have for our panelists, or
especially that person in the blue shirt.
Oh, I think he has a ton of questions, but sure.
I'm just going to bring the mic out if there's any questions so that they can be heard. I'm just curious why, I feel like there was at one point in time where there was a choice between taking this, having a set amount of money for your campaign or taking funding. I'm just wondering why we don't just level the playing field and just give everyone the same amount of money. You have to do what you can with that. Why does it always have to be a competition? And why do you need that much money?
After Watergate, the Watergate scandal, actually, Congress tried to do exactly that. They tried to say, you know what? This is ridiculous. We're just going to put a hard limit on how much candidates can spend in elections, how much they can collect from every person, how much third-party groups can spend, when they're spending directly on elections. And we're going to create, they started with just the presidential public financing system. So we'll tell the presidential candidates they can opt in, and then they don't even have to take any potentially corrupting private money. Unfortunately, and this is actually, I would argue is probably in many ways the root of our current campaign finance problems, the Supreme Court struck that system down, partially. Most notably, the Supreme Court said that spending money on political communications is akin to speech. Right. And they basically said that they could not separate the act of spending money from the act of speaking, and therefore they were going to treat the act of spending money just like speaking. Because they equated it to speech, they therefore made the government have, in order to limit speech, you have to have a very, very, very good reason, because then you're in First Amendment territory. And the Supreme Court decided that preventing corruption and facilitating participation were not good enough reasons.
And equality doesn't come to play.
And that equality, and that those weren't good enough reasons. And so that they struck down the spending caps and left in place what we've now had for the last 40 years, which is this, as somebody once said, it's like putting a man in an all-you-can-eat buffet, but just giving him a small spoon. So we actually put caps on how much people can contribute to candidates, but then told them they can collect and spend as much as they want. And that has actually created this, candidates, this is kind of a separate problem from what we were talking about before, but the situation where candidates are spending all their time fundraising and not enough time lawmaking. And all of these problems are kind of wrapped together, and it would absolutely be solved if we had hard limits on how much you could spend. That being said, it is difficult sometimes to figure out how to do that without restricting too much speech.
Right.
And there are lots of arguments one can make. I'm persuaded by the idea that elections are very special times, and that you could carve out time before an election, and during that time you can place additional restrictions on spending money because elections are so central to our democracy. That being said, you can think about all the problems this would actually cause in implementation. So, query at the end of the day if it's not better to have a system that incentivizes small donations in the form I was saying before. But that is how we got to this mess, and why under current law you cannot simply limit how much everybody's spending.
Now, I wanted to kind of get into 501c4s and all that, but
Oh
we're
man,
going to
that's going to have to be another night. I could talk the tax code
that
all night, but we can.
we could go deep into the tax code, but
But we won't.
We won't.
yes, sir.
My question relates to since the media, the airwaves are public, supposedly belong to the public. Is it possible to allot some space free of charge to the candidates so that they can present their platform, whatever that might be? And also, what does one do about the fact that most people, whether they vote or not, are acting out of deeply seated kind of psycho-emotional programming that it doesn't respond to the facts before them. So, most people are not even voting based on their own interests, or our collective interests.
Yes, that's a fantastic idea. Already under the federal campaign finance laws, candidates get the lowest unit rate for broadcasting. However, there have been ideas kicked around that I think make a lot of sense. One, for instance, to just make it even much cheaper or free for candidates vis-a-vis independent groups. It already is, but you can make it even cheaper for candidates as a way to push the money back to candidates and away from super PACs. So that is one approach. Another one is coupling free airtime with the type of public financing system that I was saying before. That's another way to induce people to participate in a campaign finance system. and allow them to get their message out there without requiring tons and tons of money. The second question is, I don't have an answer to. It's
Yeah, I'm going to avoid that one. That second one. But it was a good question. Yes, sir.
I'm glad the 501c4 was brought up because it's like I'm all for the nonpartisanship of 501c3, but it's like 1,000,000 to 1 501c3 to 501c4, and there's plenty of difficulty and strain in getting financing even now under 501c3. That it doesn't make sense. I mean, there are activist groups, and 501c4s are needed. Is there anything that could be done about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And just a quick background. Most nonprofits that you guys think about, schools, churches, et cetera, are organized under 501c3 of the tax code. You know these organizations because when you give them money, you can deduct it from your taxes. And the reason for that is because as a society, we've decided that these groups are charitable and are good to have around. And so we subsidize their operations in this way. 501c4s are a different type of nonprofit. And they also, in some ways, are subsidized under the tax code because they are not taxed in the way that a business corporation is. However, you cannot deduct donations to those groups. And they were created originally as kind of a catch-all for nonprofits that didn't social welfare that didn't look like traditional nonprofits. And actually, one example of a 501c4 are lobbying groups that actually are out there lobbying about a particular issue, let's say, owning guns or abortion rights. And that sort of advocacy doesn't fit squarely in our traditional notions of charity. However, we have seen lately huge abuse of the 501c4 status, and quite frankly, I mean, there's a couple of things that we could do. One, there's lots of groups that are kind of parading under that part of the tax code, and they shouldn't actually be considered a nonprofit. They should be considered what's called a 527, a political group, and therefore taxed at a much higher rate. So that's one thing, IRS enforcement. On a bigger level, we could also just restructure the law of nonprofits is completely absurd and crazy and probably deserves just to be blown up and started again.
Oh, don't say that.
I mean,
it should be reformed. It definitely
the NFL is a nonprofit. I mean, I dare you guys to go through it.
It's a trade association.
There are 5, when I say 501c3, 501c4, I think it goes all the way up to 501c27.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's an assignment when you go home tonight. But the immediate question is IRS enforcement or FEC enforcement, actually, because it's a violation, as far as I can tell, of campaign finance laws as well.
And to your point, like Mimi was saying, there are some C4s that are long-standing organizations that have been doing lobbying work primarily. That's what they do. And, as their secondary purpose, they can do some political activity. And as Mimi was saying, there are some groups that that appear to be abusing that secondary activity. And so the question is, and what we need the IRS to do is kind of be clear about what it means to be a C4. What is primary purpose for an organization? When is politics your primary purpose? And at this point in time, that hasn't been well defined.
Right. That's right.
So I just want to, I guess we'll close up. I've had a great time with you two wonderful women on stage.
Actually,
it's been great.
I needed an update on the Purge lawsuit. Actually,
yeah.
Great.
Yeah, it's great. I've learned more tonight than I think I have in the past couple of months. So about campaign finance and definitely about voter registration and some of the voter ID issues out there. And had a great time here. We're pleased to be here, and thanks for having us.
One other question. Do you mind?
I'm so sorry. Thank you. What I wanted to know is that you were talking about the purge lawsuit, right? And you said how sometimes that like voter registrations can be cleaned up, and how like what is the difference? I mean, I know like theoretically, like philosophically, what the difference is between purging and like just a cleanup, but what are there actual stipulations that define a purge as opposed to just standard voter cleanup? Like, is there a time limitation? Or how does that work, and how can we recognize that as a purge?
I mean, I think a lot of it is just semantics. Like when we say purge, we, associate that with being very negative. Obviously, there's like regular maintenance, there's cleanup. A supervisor of election could actually see a name of someone, whether it be an address that was returned because it didn't work out, or someone who was on the rolls who shouldn't have been because there was a clerical error, that kind of thing. Our particular concern here was the systematic purging of people, not only doing that in a way that it's very close to an election, because part of that is also, fairness and time, right? You want to make sure that if someone is purged, that they have adequate opportunity to be notified of that, and also to make sure that they fix the problem. But we also found that purge was discriminatory, because this 2,600 person voter list obviously had a disproportionate impact, because you don't have a normal list that has 80% minority voters naturally being taken off of a list. So a lot of it depends on sort of the intent and the way in which someone was actually purged. And I think the real key is when you do a systematic or a group purge, that's something that usually requires more attention. But it was particularly problematic because of the time frame, because the way that the National Voter Registration Act is situated, it basically means that the purge has to be completed 90 days before an election. So a lot of these purges were starting well after that period. So that was one of the issues. We're also particularly concerned about minority voters and whether they have the opportunity to vote. And of course, just on a broader scale, many say that the state of Florida will ultimately determine the election, because it is, there's a particular I-4 corridor in Central Florida that basically is considered to be, I guess, the undecided voter. That is the bellwether of how the American public thinks. And actually, sadly, I'm from that area.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm not undecided.
So I guess we'll go ahead and finish up. Are there any closing comments that?
Just thank you guys very much for coming out on a rainy night. Thank you for hosting us. We appreciate it greatly.
And thank you so much, Isaiah, for moderating.
Oh, thank you for having us.
We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
And of course, thank you so much, Anna, and all of you all for joining us on such a rainy, torrential downpouring of a day.
And I have one announcement. I have to make this announcement or I'll get in trouble with my organization. So Alliance for Justice, we are in conjunction with the New York Bar we're having a panel discussion kind of on the same subject matter it's at the New York Bar building on, who knows, I'm not from here, I don't want to
think
get
it's like on West 44th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue.
Yeah, that's right.
That's it. It's on kind of the same subject matter: voter suppression, redistricting, Citizens United, and campaign finance law, with Lawrence Lessig, who is a well-known scholar on these issues, and Keisha Gaskins from Brennan Center, and a couple other panelists to be named.
And I think it's 42 West 44th Street.
Yeah.
I think that's it. I'm from DC. I don't want to get it wrong. So, and if you'd like more information about that, I can email you the invitation or save the date. Right. A video outside.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's every year we do a film. This year it's on the 1% Court, and how the court is moving towards a more corporate direction, the Supreme Court. So we've got a film coming out on that. It's not all about Citizens United, but we do touch on it in the movie, in the film, and outside we've got some free discs for our film from this year.
Great.
So, all right. Well, this was really good. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.